Chapter 4 The Gathering Storm. With the rest of the soldiers surrendering, bringing the caravan the rest of the way across the river went relatively quickly. After ensuring that we found the orders which were meant to be brought to the outpost, we gathered a full list of the contents of the rest of the wagons. Relatively little was of interest to our cause, so it was only natural to abandon a number of them. All in all, by the time we moved on, only 2 of the wagons were being kept, plus the cart with the hand's supplies, of course. Once we were on the move again, Neleus began to move through the rest of the surrendered and surviving soldiers. He told us that he meant to determine which would be prisoners and which would be willing to join our cause, but the rest of the hand saw through him with relative ease. Neleus did not care for prisoners. If he could not win over one of the soldiers, they would almost certainly be set free within the next few days. Of course, there was also the risk that one of the soldiers would prove to be dedicated to the crown beyond what might be expected. In that case, well, Neleus also did not care for threats to himself or the hand. Over the next few days, Neleus slowly wormed his way into the hearts of the soldiers, in much the same fashion he had mine. Few proved to be resistant to his charms, and in short order most of them had abandoned the symbols of the crown, and more than one had taken it upon themselves to don some makeshift symbology of the silver hand. It was truly incredible watching our leader work. He knew each of their names within hours, and within days he had built individual rapport with them all. He teased out motivations, desires, family stories, and reasons for working with the crown quickly, easily, and gently, in such a fashion that each of the soldiers seemed to believe it the natural progression of their communication. By the end of the first week traveling with the soldiers, nearly all of them had warmed not just to Neleus, but through him to the rest of us. But it could never be quite that easy. Even then there was one holdout, Rakor. Dark-eyed and bright-haired, a combination rarely found within the Shattered Kingdoms, Rakor was a burning icon of discontent against Neleus's soft, natural bond-building. His loyalty to the crown was deeply evident from the first, and his hatred for us was just the same. It was a fair hatred, of course, even if his loyalty was misplaced. We had, after all, killed several of his comrades. Even with the fairness of his hatred, though, I was disconcerted by Rakor. Neleus seemed unbothered by it, but as the other soldiers warmed to us, Rakor dripped poison into their ears, his own evidently silver tongue cool and calculated, pointing out tiny errors and blowing them up into glaring character flaws. And with the matter of their dead comrades, it was hardly a tiny thing to begin with. By the time I convinced Neleus that Rakor needed to be separated from the other soldiers, he had managed to work against us well enough that a small faction of the survivors were well and truly with him. Or perhaps, against us. At the end of the second week, Neleus told us that it was time to remove Rakor. He would not be won over, and his malcontented chatter was managing to seep through the soldiers even as he was isolated from them. The task fell to me. It should not surprise you that it fell to me, but I sensed that it might. I was, after all, a 14-year-old, and the newest member of the hand. Even with that being true, however, I was naturally predisposed to the work in a way that few others were. Some say all the children are, although in my experience that is not entirely true. Nevertheless, even after my first kill, the brute Titus, I felt no sorrow, no shame, no failure of my humanity. And I never would. Well, perhaps once, but that came far later. We told the soldiers that Rakor was going to be executed, of course. Neleus's path was always with pure honesty. He had a natural talent for deception, but rarely chose to exercise it, much to the rest of our chagrin. His only deceptions were on the battlefield, as with the shades he had conjured for our bluff. The news tore through the soldiers like an arrow. Each were told that they could watch if they pleased, but had no obligation to do so. Rakor's punishment was his own, and it need not weigh on them. Besides, a hand execution was a quiet thing. We made no spectacle of the matter, lest people think us killers at heart. Nevertheless, several of them gathered. Rakor stood proud in front of the others, and I stood behind him, a deadly shadow. Neleus had told him he would be allowed a final word to those who would listen, and it seemed he meant to make use of it. The man's voice was an odd thing. One moment it seemed cool and calm like a creek in the forest, only for it to surge into a violent churn, much like the river at which we had taken the caravan. "I die a proud servant of the crown," he said, "where the rest of you have abandoned our proud nation for empty promises of glory and renown. I will do my duty to the end." I pushed him to his knees, sliding my dagger from its sheath, and placed it at his throat. He tilted his head back, dark eyes drinking in the sky above for a moment or two before he let them drift closed. Just as I began to move to finish the matter, a flash of light blinded me. I was startled for a moment, but quickly gathered myself and moved my hand in that practiced motion, only to find that my blade met none of the resistance of flesh. I let out a loud curse and began to flail about as my vision blurred back into normality, trying to place Rakor. When my vision returned in full, the accursed man was gone. I spit on the ground beside me, brow furrowed into a scowl, and glared around the circle of soldiers. Each seemed just as shocked and bleary as me. Splintering fuck. Neleus, who had been at the edge of the small circle, stepped forward and knelt, hand going to the ground at my feet. He fished out a tiny crystalline sphere, embedded into the dirt beneath me, and held it up. We exchanged looks, and I spat again. Double splintering fuck. The incident with Rakor hung over us as a gloomy cloud for nearly the rest of our journey, finally fading only with the return of my little fox friend. The creature was once again wary at first, with the wagons and soldiers alike, but after a few days warmed up enough that it would take treats offered by nearly any of our number. The only one it strayed away from was Metka, who gave off a feeling of dread as Ryota's condition continued to deteriorate. Few of us could stay around her for long without feeling the same. Mere days before we were set to reach our destination, one of the soldiers came to Metka. He proposed something foolish. Metka, of course, agreed instantly. Any of us would have, to save Ryota, foolish or not. That night, under the cover of the wagons, lest the Shrieker still be around somewhere, silent in the clouds above, we gathered. The rest of us hung back around the entrance to the wagon, not wanting to get in the way of Metka and the soldier. A series of concentric circles were burnt into the wagon's floorboards, symbology from before the Cataclysm etched into the charcoal lines of the image, and Ryota's body lay atop it all. The soldier chanted deeply, reading lines from a book he had fished out of the wagon's storage. They took on an ominous tone almost naturally, regardless of his own voice or intent, as if the air itself lent them that quality. Each line echoed inside my mind for a moment, making the next indistinct and difficult to grasp, until none of the words seemed stable in the least, swimming impossibly from one sound to the next in a flow so disjointed and cacophonous that I found myself doubting that it could possibly be coming from the tiny, human frame of the soldier before me. Swirling air within the wagon jerked me from my trance-like infatuation with the words. I could not help but attempt to find its source, though no such source proved obvious, even as I glanced outside the wagon, lest it somehow be external in origin. Neleus seemed unfazed, staring ahead with an eager, almost childlike expression of wonder. Lek's arms were crossed over his chest, and one hand was repeatedly making a sign I believed to be an invocation of some wildling god's protection. Garivor was the closest to my own reaction, and our eyes locked for a moment in our attempts to work out what was going on. We exchanged shaky grins, then turned our gaze back to the scene ahead. The symbology within the circles lit from within, faint and orange-red, almost imperceptible for the moment. The odd wind seemed to halt for a moment, only for Ryota's shivering, emaciated body to lift into the air, the wind clearly gathering itself beneath her. The symbols growed brighter and brighter, finally seeming to rip out from the circle on the floor, leaping into the air in a joyous swirl like that of embers, spat from a fire by a disturbance at its base. A light began to gather around Ryota, then build and build until none of us could look at her any longer. From behind clenched eyelids I saw a flash of light far more intense than whatever magic had disguised Rakor's escape, and then it all faded. I heard a gasp from Metka, small and soft, and cautiously opened my eyes. Ryota stood in the center of the circles, life restored to her skin. Ash seemed to stain her fingers black, and her hair was alight, no longer just the fire red it had once been, now seeming as true fire, dancing and flickering with an unmistakable light, a light now matched in her eyes. Her face was, for the moment, grim. She was terrible and beautiful, and I stared with abject wonder. A sorcerer. Ryota had taken only moments to shake off the grim state which had enveloped her, and she and Metka had shooed us all away, wanting some time to themselves to celebrate her safety and gather themselves. We had, of course, ceded that to them, after each telling Ryota how happy we were to see her healed. We found ourselves around the bonfire. It was the space in which we had always talked, letting some piece of whatever had happened most recently out to the only other people in the world who might understand. We were joined now by several other fires, flickering around the tiny circle of our camp, but we ignored them for the moment. A member of the Hand had come near death, and was brought back by sorcery. There would have been debate about the nature of the spirit she was bound to, but her hair and eyes had rendered that question unnecessary. Whatever it was, the spirit was firebound. Garivor gestured at our own campfire with a grin, cracking some joke about how our fires over the years must have really felt a part of the Hand. We laughed, but somewhere deep and secret within I held on to that. It felt right, in a way I couldn't explain. The fox crept up next to us at the fire and settled near Lek, tail flicking over the quiet man's feet. We all pretended not to notice as he snuck tiny snippets of his own meal down to the creature, hiding away secret smiles behind our hands. Come the next morning, we gathered up the soldiers for a quick explanation of the plan we had for the coming days. As Neleus told them of the outpost and the plan I had devised for him there, I made a quick head count of the soldiers. One more had gone missing. I grimaced faintly and tried to work out which one it was, but I needn't have bothered. The only one missing was one of Rakor's. Burying down the worry for this apparently ongoing situation, we reinitiated our march. It was almost spectacular, seeing the soldiers in their trained, armor-clad lockstep behind us. Only the mud on their boots and Garivor's stream of curses about the heat of the sun overhead kept it from being so. Ryota walking alongside us again after days without her brought each of us energy. At least I think it was her being there. In retrospect, it is not implausible that the spirit she was now bonded to was partially responsible. Metka especially was revived so thoroughly that it became difficult to imagine her as dour as she had been. It was strange to think that Ryota was almost certainly the most dangerous of us now. She had never been ineffective in a fight, exactly. Her axe was always sharp, and she was fairly skilled with it as a result of her experience in the Silver War. It wasn't her main asset, though. Her penchant for disguise and stealth had always been the essential core of her usefulness to the Hand, as well as a keen mind for finance, a matter most of us disregarded at the best of times. Now, though, we had yet to see the strength of Ryota's bound spirit, of course. Her hair flickering over her head implied a notable danger, and her blackened fingers spoke softly of the chaos she might wreak, but it was all speculative. Nevertheless, despite my standing ticket into the Silver World and Neleus's prodigious capacity for magic, sorcery had a reputation. Even before the Cataclysm, sorcerers had existed. According to my lessons as a child, as well as my later studies as an adult, they had once been far less powerful, and even then a sorcerer trained in the arts of warfare was said to have been an intimidating thing. In the Age of the Shattered Kingdoms, though, the Cataclysm-strengthened sorcerers had carved a reputation in blood. Shaking myself from the reverie, I smiled to see Ryota and Metka holding hands, striding at the front of the procession in happy quiet. None of the chatter of the soldiers behind seemed to touch them, and the rest of the hand would never disturb them in a rare moment of peace and happiness. Besides, the coming days would bring plenty of struggle, even with a newly bound sorcerer on our side, and whatever peace could be wrenched out of the claws of chaos in the meantime was welcome. We made camp just shy of the outpost. Our wagons were placed like a wall between us and the stone tower which made up the most intimidating portion of the place. No fires would be lit tonight, lest we make ourselves even more obvious. The soldiers were less than pleased by the idea of a night without fire, but most understood why it wasn't an option, and made do with tight clusters of bodies, huddled for warmth against the cold of the night. Neleus did not sleep, and so neither did the rest of the hand. It was not a hard and fast rule in the strictest sense, but when our leader was restless, so too were we. We gathered around the cart, trading fond memories of past scores and personal events. Ryota, face contorted into a blank mask and hand gripped tightly by Metka, recounted her encounter with the Shrieker before moving us back to gentler memories. When morning came, it was soft. Orange and purple danced on the horizon, with small clouds driven by desert winds from the wildlands across the wall, giving the colors an ethereal feeling. It was a truly perfect morning. It would be a shame to ruin it. The camp stirred to waking quietly, with the hand and I spreading throughout and ensuring each group of soldiers was up and ready. We needed to be ready before those manning the outpost to hit our ideal window, and fortunately the vast majority of them seemed to understand as much. Ryota and I did the work of making our wagons look as ragged as possible, while Neleus dressed up in the nonsensical finery of the nobles. Metka and Garivor put on the armor of fallen soldiers. Metka, of course, looked right at home in the armor. Garivor looked more than a little out of place, as his lanky frame was far too tall for any armor he wasn't far too skinny for. Even aside from the ill-fitting armor, his spear was far from believable as the weapon of one of the crown's soldiers. At the very least, his armor being nowhere close to the correct size helped to sell the disheveled look we were looking for. Lek had refused to don the crown's armor, and so he was sitting inside one of the wagons. Ryota and I would eventually have to do the same, as she was now even more outlandishly unbelievable in the role of a soldier than Garivor, and I was, for all my grumbled insistence of adulthood and maturity, still 14. For now, though, we did as we could, ensuring the wagons looked firmly worn without seriously harming their operation. Blessedly, we finished our task just in time to hit our ideal window and slipped into the wagon with Lek. We exchanged looks, somewhere between eager for and scared of what was to come. A few brief checks from Neleus with the hand, and the soldiers in the wagons began to move. Within 10 or so minutes, we heard indistinct shouting from the outpost ahead. Each of us instinctively checked our weapons, suddenly certain something, somehow, would be going wrong. When the wagons came to a shuddering halt, I nearly leapt from my seat, a dagger half pulled from its sheath before I calmed myself and settled back into place. The sound of Neleus conversing loudly with the lookout, affecting a capital accent as if he really were one of those idiotic nobles, made me smile a bit, although the ease with which it seemed to come to him did worry me. "We come from the capital to see Knight Commander Venus, with new orders and reinforcements. As you can see, we were attacked by bandits along the way and lost many of our complement. If you would open the gates so that we might make certain our escape from those splintering hayseeds, I will be sure to inform Venus of your service." It was half true, as all the best lies are. The guards, faced with Neleus's melodic charm and a lie so deeply woven into and around the truth that essentially everything it stated managed to be technically true, never stood a chance.